Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us on WebEx and to who is now joining us on Facebook Live. The Geneva Environment Network has the pleasure to welcome you today virtually for the 7th session of the Geneva Big Plastic Pollution Dialogues, organized in collaboration with the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention Secretariat, the Center for International Environmental Law, the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute, and the governments of Norway and of Switzerland. For those who wouldn't yet know our platform, we are a network of more than 100 institutions and secretariats based in Geneva that make this region one of the global hubs for environmental governance. Administrated by the United Nations Environment Programme and supported by Switzerland, we organize various networking activities, including regular multi-stakeholder roundtables and briefings on major environmental trends. The Geneva Big Plastic Pollution Dialogues aim at linking different plastic issues to the governance question and encourage increased engagement in the run-up to various global environmental negotiations that will take place this year and or next year. We want to understand how we are using specific global instruments to address the plastics crisis or how we could use them better. One of the important negotiations that is soon going to take place, at least the first part of it, is the 5th session of the United Nations Environment Assembly. And indeed, the first part is taking place later this month, and various events addressing plastics are going to be held next week in the run-up to this important meeting. We will mention them at the end of this event. Today's session will focus on plastics in the life cycle, and it's the last of our first series of dialogues. Our moderator will mention in his introduction some of the findings of the 6 other sessions we have hosted so far. And before I give the floor to today's moderator, who will guide you through this session, let me briefly introduce you to our panel. From Paris, we have with us Laurence Milay-Canals, the head of the Life Cycle Initiative hosted by the United Nations Environment Programme. In Geneva is with us Teresa Moreira, the head of the Competition and Consumer Policies branch at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. In Brussels, we have with us Hugo Shelley from the European Commission. Hugo is the head of the Multilateral Environmental Cooperation Unit at the Directorate General for the Environment. Also in Geneva, Awidya Santikaya, Counselor at the Permanent Mission of Indonesia to the United Nations in Geneva. Kirsten Hughes is also with us from Geneva. She's the Director of the Global Plastic Action Partnership at the World Economic Forum. And we have also with us Colston Wesholtz, Senior Policy Manager at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And finally, today's moderator, David Azoulay, is the Director of the Environmental Health Program of the Center of International Environmental Law, one of the co-organizers of this series. Let me also remind you before we start that the video of this event and the presentations made, as well as a summary, will be available online on the webpage of the event. You can raise your questions in the Q&A box throughout the event, and we will address them in the last part of this session. David, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Diana, and welcome to all of the participants and to all of our speakers. Thank you very much for the Geneva Environment Network for organizing and facilitating this discussion. Maybe to set the scene, what I would mention is that a lot of work has been happening on plastics in a lot of different spaces, and it has been the focus of a lot of interest and a lot of research recently. And some of the conclusions that came out of this is that the plastic economy and the plastic supply chains are very complex. They are global, and they're driven by many various factors. Another element that came out of the work that was being done and that was highlighted in the previous events of this series is that impacts happen, negative impacts happen throughout the whole supply chain life cycle, whether we're talking about impacts on human health, impacts on the environment, impacts on human rights enjoyment by different kinds of population. These do happen at every single stage of the life cycle. And as a conclusion or in response to this, the work that was done in particular by the ad hoc expert group that was convened under the United Nations Environment Assembly to discuss the issue of marine litter, microplastic, and plastic pollution did draw the very clear conclusion that there was a need to look at this question of the plastic crisis that we're currently facing in a life cycle frame, or in the frame of a life cycle and full supply chain, in order to design policy solutions and all sorts of solutions really that are comprehensive and that will be efficient in helping us addressing this particular issue. So this event was designed to allow us to hear from a variety of stakeholders, from international governmental organizations, from governments, from corporate actors, and others, about what are the initiatives that they are putting in place and how they integrate the life cycle thinking in the context of the work that they're doing at the national level or following their own responsibilities. And I'm also hoping that as we do this, we will hear about the initiatives, the models, the tools that can be used to foster this kinds of approach, the limitations as well of the various tools and models that exist, and how they can be combined and approached to develop effective response options. So with no further ado, and we'll get back we'll get back to the slide that you were seeing earlier now. So without further ado, because I want us to have as much space as possible for the presenters and for the discussions that will hopefully follow each of those, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Lorenz Milay Canals, the head of the Life Cycle Initiatives at UNEP. Lorenz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David, for the introduction, and thank you very much for the Geneva Environment Network to gather all of us here today. So good afternoon, indeed good evening or good morning, wherever you are. Today I will present some of the work on life cycle assessment that has been applied to plastic products within the context of UNEP and specifically in the Life Cycle Initiative. With a specific focus on the application of LCA, this life cycle assessment, so the assessment tool to single-use plastic products in the context of one of the resolutions decided in the previous UNEA 4. If we could move to the next slide, just to give you a bit of the context of where I see it, the Life Cycle Initiative is a multi-stakeholder partnership that brings the science of life cycle approaches to informing governments and the international agenda. One of the key global areas where we've been working in informing decisions and policy making, where we are actually embedding more life cycle thinking towards the achievement of the global agenda goals is in addressing plastics pollution. So moving to the next slide, we can see specifically that we have been focusing work on the pollution from single-use plastic products particularly, and the significant public attention that they have generated in the last few years. Single-use plastic products present, we're still in the previous slide, please. In single-use plastic products, we see that they present a significant environmental problem and a global challenge due to the massive scale at which they are generated, which also bring massive waste generation. And this is usually coupled with poor recycling rates and collection rates, which then results in plastic products that often end up littering the natural environment. Or sometimes they are used as fuel or simply burned, particularly in poorer communities, which leads to health impacts. Or they, as I said, end down in the environment and break down into microplastics, where they may also enter the food chain. So there is clearly a need to find alternatives to single-use plastic items, and to assess also that the impacts of the alternatives that we find are really helping to reduce the impacts from single-use plastic products across the full life cycle, as David was saying, and also considering all potential environmental impacts. So this is the context that was well captured during the 4th UN Environment Assembly resolution on addressing single-use plastic products pollution. Now, yes, please move to the next one. where we see that in this resolution, UNEP was asked, was requested by member states to make available the existing information on actions that member states are already taking in addressing plastic pollution, as well as information on the full life cycle environmental impacts of plastic products and their alternatives. And we had to provide this information in advance of UNEA 5, which, as you know, takes place in a few days. So with the Life Cycle Initiative support, UNEP compiled a series of meta-analyses of LCA studies on a diverse set of single-use plastic products. We covered shopping bags, beverage bottles, takeaway food packaging, beverage cups, tableware, nappies, menstrual products, face masks, which obviously came in the context of the pandemic, and more products are probably to come. In these meta-studies, we actually gathered the available information. And in addition, we organized a series of consultations and webinars that took place last October to bring together what actions member states have already been putting in place. As a kind of run-up towards UNEA, next week we will be holding one of these virtual side events that Diana mentioned in the beginning. We will be launching there the integrative report. You see the cover in your slides. We will be launching the integrative report that brings together all the knowledge that has been gathered. So you're all obviously invited, and I think the link will be provided at the end of this session, but it's also embedded in the slides if you can download them. In the next slide, just to remind everyone what life cycle assessment is. We cannot go into the details, but just that it's a standardized way to assess the environmental impacts of products and services across their life cycle. And this enables fair comparisons between products, so we can actually say what really is happening in between products. The meta-analysis that we did bring together the key studies that exist on the products in scope, and we could then draw the key conclusions from those comparisons. You will find several of the studies already online, and more are coming in the coming days. Also, the recordings from the webinars are in the website that you see in your slides. So please, if you can move to the next slide. Unfortunately, we will not have the time to go into a lot of details, but here are some of the key messages. What we found is that certainly the results demonstrate that life cycle assessment, LCA, can usefully inform the development of policy on single-use plastic products by showing the environmental impact trade-offs that happen between these products and their alternatives. There is one key overarching message, which is that the promotion of reusable alternatives is a clear goal for policies. So it really is not about the material. It's really about what we do with the material. It's moving beyond disposable products. Addressing plastic pollution requires to change the system in which we're operating, and the LCA studies can help us to inform this change. So we see from the LCA results that the design of products is a critical area of action to reduce their environmental impacts. As mentioned, it is critical to understand that all materials have a cost. It's not about plastic, it's how we use plastic. So the policy should encourage reuse of products multiple times. And then we also see that LCA has some limitations in that the impacts from litter, for instance, are not yet considered. Let's move quickly to the next slide because I'm running out of time. I just snipped this infographic from one of the reports to show you what kind of information you will find. The idea is, by the way, we're still tinkering with the graph, so please don't use it. You will have it next week in the reports available. The idea here is to show which are the elements in the system that really influence the result. So in the rows we see what kind of system characteristics, a type of waste management, whereas in the columns we see the types of behaviors that we see from consumers, like how they wash, for instance, in this case, reusable cups, or how responsible they are in separating waste. The blue cells are where reusable cups are favorable, and most of the times reusable cups are better. But of course, there are certain circumstances in which this might not be the case, particularly if reusable cups are not reused, which is kind of obvious, but it's important to highlight. So please, let's move to the last slide, just to highlight again that one of the key things that we are observing is that there are currently in the policy actions that we observe is that they still focus a lot on the end of life of plastics. And indeed, we need to have a more holistic approach, as David was also mentioning. We need to consider all the stages. We need this kind of broad, comprehensive policy measures at each stage of the life cycle and in different levels. We're seeing this, for instance, in extended producer responsibility schemes, the increase of deposit return schemes, in order to increase the rates of collection for reuse or recycling. Certainly, we need to work a lot on consumer awareness, although on consumer behavior. But of course, consumer behavior is important, but not enough. We also need that the market conditions are right. And from a methodological point of view, I can also say that we're working on methods to include the impacts from marine litter in LCA, in the impact assessment of LCAs. You can see it in the project marilka.org. And we're also seeing progress in the revision of emission factors for oil and gas production, which will impact the climate change impacts linked to plastic products. This is probably going to change results significantly in the future. And finally, just to remind you of this event next week, to which you're all cordially invited, in the context of UNEA 5. And again, the launch of this report addressing single-use plastic products pollution using a life cycle approach. The link is in the next, in the slide, sorry, and in the next, it's just to close. And thank you very much for your attention and looking forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Lorenz, and thank you very much also for almost sticking with the time. I left you a little more time, and I don't want to encourage other speakers to do so, but I think it's useful to let everyone have a chance to develop their arguments. Before we move on to the next speaker, maybe I had a follow-up question for you, Lorenz. I think this is really very exciting and promising work, and I wondered if you could tell us shortly a little about how you curate the information and how you take into consideration the different assumptions and methods that exist for different LCAs. The different LCAs make different assumptions. The results, like with every model, depends on the parameters that you set. So I was wondering if you could tell us, even just briefly, about the mechanism that you have in place to curate this information.
Absolutely. In this case, I mean, we're obviously fortunate that there are already quite a lot of studies available. So we picked mainly from studies that have already been peer reviewed. So it means that they've already been revised, and the information that goes in is kind of curated. And then at the same time, the advantage of a meta study is that you can focus on, well, actually, what are the assumptions in the different studies that lead to the conclusions? So by pulling them together, we can see also what are the key parameters that affect the results. And that's what we're trying to convey in that kind of matrix that I showed in the end. So certainly the results depend, and that's the typical answer from the LCA practitioner. But for policymakers, it's important to know, what do the results depend on? And therefore, in my context, what kind of environmental impacts can I expect if I do A or if I do B? So at the same time, I'm sorry, that's the last point. In our studies, we also engaged in quite a multi-stakeholder consultation. So we brought the conclusions and the conversation of the studies in a multi-stakeholder revision process. So we got inputs from industry, but also from policymakers, from scientists and NGOs.
Well, thank you very much. And I was looking forward to read the report before I heard the full talk. And now I'm very much looking forward to read the full report. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Teresa Moreira. She's from UNCTAD, and she heads the work on or she's going to talk to us at least today about the contribution that consumer-focused policies can bring to the conversation. Teresa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and again, thank you very much to Diana and the network for the invitation. As you can see, of course, UNCTAD is probably more familiar to most of you through our work on trade and environment. Last week, one of my colleagues actually intervened on plastics and trade, but today I'm going to talk to you a little bit on something that is maybe less known, but as we heard from the previous speaker, very important. So UNCTAD is formally within the UN system the focal point for both competition law and policy, for a number of years, and more recently, from a formal point of view, the focal point for consumer protection law and policy being the custodian of the United Nations set of principles on competition and the UN guidelines for consumer protection, which remain the only two international agreed instruments that gather all member states in these very important topics. Next slide, please. So, of course, we are only the coordinators, so to speak, of the now implementation of the United Nations guidelines. And I just wanted to highlight some of the recommendations which are extremely broad and extremely cross-cutting, and at the same time with a lot of detail, but some of the issues that are relevant for this discussion. So first of all, the importance of promoting sustainable consumption. This was actually the subject of the first revision of the guidelines in 1999. And the recognition of consumers' legitimate needs, which usually are interpreted as consumer rights, which are access to information for informed choices, consumer education, again, the promotion of sustainable consumption patterns, and for member states, which of course are typically the first addressees of this kind of recommendations, the relevance of adopting legal and institutional frameworks, so policies, regarding the broad areas covered under consumer protection. And for the first time, very recently, in the last and second revision of the guidelines, a chapter addressed at businesses promoting good business practices. Next slide, please. So, education and information programs. I think our colleagues from UNEP are quite familiar with this, actually, because I wanted to highlight the work of the Consumer Information Program under this One Planet network, where a very good partner of yours is, of course, working also with the Environment Program of the UN. This is Consumers International, the International Federation of Consumer Associations, which, of course, is extremely active and really representative, being active in so many countries, namely a lot of developing countries. But this is just to highlight, and picking a little bit of what Lorenz said, the importance, first of all, of consumers' information. And consumer experts sees this as a right, but in a way, a little bit of an obligation. So we, all of us as consumers, need to make the effort of inform ourselves so that we buy goods and services that are adjusted to our needs, to our wishes, but also in a sustainable and responsible manner. Also, the fact that these education and information programs are not exclusive of governments, but they are very much launched through the initiative of civil society organizations, such as consumer associations, even business organizations, and other relevant stakeholders, and highlighting here needs and challenges of vulnerable and disadvantaged consumers that need to be reached with a special message so that they can really grasp what we are trying to convey. Next slide, please. So the chapter on sustainable consumption, as I said, was added in the first revision of the guidelines. The main points are just highlighted here, and I think they won't come as a surprise to you. So the fact that this is an issue of shared responsibility that needs to be discussed and implemented in partnership with all relevant stakeholders, that it requires mixed instruments and tools, both for policy making and for implementation of actions, and even, why not, law enforcement, the need for additional and specific research. So the life cycle assessments were a very good example already. The importance of completely involving businesses. So not just encouraging them, but hearing from them, because again, sustainable consumption needs to be matched by sustainable production. And consumers, no matter how aware and environmental conscious they are, they need to find products in the market that represent more sustainable ways of consumption. Next slide, please. So something also on good business practices. I think it's quite interesting, and we thought it was a very good addition to the guidelines that businesses were directly addressed and that the guidelines throughout their recommendations encourage high levels of ethical conduct. They highlight the role of private sector standards, which is also very important for this issue. And also they refer to the role of self-regulation as a complement to any public or even other civil society initiatives that are launched on this in this way. Next slide, please. So on sustainable consumption and production, of course, this won't be news. I even took an image, I should say, from the UN Environment Program, just to highlight that, of course, the program has been working on consumer protection in this view for quite some time before. Well, UNCTAD was already doing capacity building, but did not have the formality of this coordination point. So let me highlight the importance of reducing waste generation through the reduction, the recycle, and the reuse of, namely, plastics, which is so important. Next slide, please. Other ideas that gather a little bit what I already said on consumer policy specific measures, but also broad economic policy measures. Next slide, please. Because of course, companies play a major role. I wanted to share with you the World Consumer Protection Map, which is an interactive tool that UNCTAD has designed to, in a formal way, have a full stock taking of what member states, the 195 members of UNCTAD, are doing in the field of legal and institutional framework for consumer protection. Next slide. Here you have an example. So far, we only have 90 formal replies, but of the countries that have consumer laws covering the promotion of sustainable consumption. Next slide. And this can go very quickly. Just a couple of ideas on the role of consumer protection agencies. Again, here, a word on the circular economy to, again, bring together businesses and the private sector, so the production side and the consumer side. Next slide. I'm getting to the end. Some data, of course, the plastics, either through a full ban or phase out single-use plastics, again, bring us to the reduce, reuse, and recycle, and to which my UNCTAD colleagues have added an S for increased supply of plastic substitutes and a W for waste management. Next slide, please. Okay, the impact of developing countries, of course, coming from UNCTAD, I would need to highlight this. It's interesting that this study that I show here, which was actually commissioned by the Environment Program in focus in Southeast Asia, of course, just highlights that consumers are really aware and interested in developing their information, but also acting in this issue, even though they may need more information and education campaigns. And of course, they need to find in the market plastic product substitutes or better ways how to reuse and recycle. Next slide, please. Yes.
Please conclude. Okay. Oops,
yes.
it's the last slide. Perfect.
And I'm concluding, but let me just, in the conclusions, I just highlight what I just said. So the multi-stakeholder dialogue is essential, more joint work and coordination at international level. A final word on competition law and policy, David, if you allow me, just because we also have this program. And competition law and policy, which has been adopted by 140 countries across the world, it's quite impressive, is often seen as a hurdle, as an obstacle to innovative agreements between competitors for promoting green solutions. There is recently a discussion, namely within the European Union, how competition law and policy can actually consider social and environmental impacts as other more consumer welfare stricter impacts. And from this point of view, even in public subsidies, so what is called usually state aid, competition law and policy can actually encourage further sustainability. And this is something that I just leave because this is in the early stages. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Teresa, and sorry to have rushed you a little. There was a lot of very interesting information, and even for me, who's been working on this for quite some time, I discovered quite a bit of things from the work of UNTAD. So thank you very, very much. Just building on the last point you raised, I found this extremely interesting, and it also coincides with other research that we have commissioned, actually, and that we have done, showing how regulation protecting health, consumers, or the environment actually, and contrary to what is usually thought, has a very beneficial and spurring effect on innovation. And I'd be happy to provide some information about this to whoever is interested. But maybe just one quick follow-up question, because as I said, I myself discovered quite a lot of interesting work, and I could see as we're presenting how a lot of the work that you're doing is very closely connected to the work being done by UNEP or by work being developed at WTO. So I wondered whether, I imagine that you have some formal and informal collaboration with other IGOs, but I wonder whether you thought there was a need for increased collaboration, or if you thought the existing collaboration were good enough to get the best out of everyone's work.
Thank you very much, David. No, yes, I think, well, within UNCTAD, I should say that even consumer protection is a little bit of a niche, even though, again, this is a cross-cutting area because it concerns now education, information, sustainable consumption, but it also covers, I don't know, financial services and dispute resolution and redress. So, and we are all consumers. Here we face a major obstacle between brackets, which is it is very difficult for consumers to speak in a single voice, also because of course we tend to have different preferences and needs and wishes. That's why it is so important to have consumer organizations such as Consumers International and others, you know, like CUTS, also a very good partner of ours, to voice these concerns to public bodies, to international organizations, but also because they are in the field closer to consumers. In any case, this is something, this area, I mean, as Lauren said at the beginning, for us to change the way we consume and we produce, a combination of actions, of partners, first of all, and of tools, of instruments need to be put in place. UNCTAD, of course, addresses mostly this topic. It's not my team. It's actually another team that I'm currently temporarily overseeing, the Trade and Environment and Climate Change branch. But of course, so they look at plastics from the point of view of international trade, you see? So, of course, they have a dialogue regularly with the Environment Program, but they deal with the trade issue. For instance, just for your information, last year we submitted on behalf of Fiji and China, a submission to the WTO Committee on Trade and Environment on plastics. So, of course, there are a number of issues that are a little bit overlapping, but I think that is quite okay. UNCTAD exists to support developing countries to better integrate in the world economy, which is a very, very ambitious aspiration, so to speak. But this presupposes actually working closely with WTO, with the Environment Program and several other programs, so in IRIS, that are not relevant here. But so I can conclude just agreeing that we should always try to work closer together. First of all, get the information, the context, and that's why I'm so grateful to Diana and her team to have allowed me to share what we are doing in this area, and hopefully we will be in touch for future cooperation opportunities. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Teresa, and I suspect that most of our participants will have found this extremely interesting as well. Now, after having heard from some initiatives from the international organizations, I now want to turn to two speakers, and we'll start with Kristen Hughes, who is the director for the Global Plastic Action Partnership at the World Economic Forum, who can tell us a little more about initiatives arising.
David has frozen, so I think Christine, you can go.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. I would say also thanks to David when he's back. And huge thanks to the Geneva Network for organizing the discussion today, and also thanks to UNEP for inviting me to join you. As mentioned, I'm Kristen Hughes. I have the tremendous honor of leading the Global Plastic Action Partnership. It's a multi-stakeholder platform aimed at shaping a more sustainable and inclusive world through the eradication of plastic pollution. The Global Plastic Action Partnership is housed at the World Economic Forum. It's a multi-stakeholder initiative aimed at eradicating plastic pollution through the engagement of public and private players. I was really pleased that I heard Teresa mention the word multi-stakeholder quite a number of times. And I see such a tremendous opportunity then for us to build on the statements that she's already given as I explain a little bit more about our initiative. GPAP was created in 2018 by a group of public, private, and civil society leaders with the World Economic Forum because they believed that when we come together, we can create real change and drive real impact. It was a perfect storm of Canada chairing the G7, the UK launching the Commonwealth Clean Ocean Alliance, at the same time that consumer brands like PepsiCo and Coca-Cola were being hammered by their constituents for their plastic bottles ending up in the oceans. Those players all came together, approached the World Economic Forum, trying to figure out how we could address plastic waste and pollution. 2 years on, we are in 3 partner countries, Indonesia, Ghana, and Vietnam, and we are beginning to see change take shape there because of this public-private unique conversations. We've just announced a 4th partnership with Nigeria. We hope that that will come to shape in the coming weeks. As you see in the next slide, there's also conversations around these public-private partnerships, which also include civil society, academia, international organizations, all contributors and allies who are absolutely essential to work together in the solution that aims to realistically end plastic pollution and to develop a circular economy for plastic within our lifetimes. Some of the things just to highlight, and again, don't want to duplicate what Teresa was saying, but when we think about the role of governments need to set the targets, implement programs that will lead to concrete changes and create incentives that shape positive environment for investing in steps aligned with plastic waste reduction. Then you've got the private sector and businesses who can translate to greener supply chains. These consumer brands goods companies, for example, are already looking to redesign their packaging to use plastics alternatives or plastics that are recycled and recyclable. Furthermore, we're seeing a lot of interesting business models come to life around reuse and refill, such that we're really encouraging the circular economy for plastics. Again, Teresa mentioned consumers and the adoption of principles in the reduce, reuse, recycle. How can we as consumers bring those principles to life throughout our daily lifestyles? And investors are also at the forefront trying to find ways to inject funding into the innovations that will spur this circular economy to life. Next slide, please. As part of the Global Plastic Action Partnership, we also have national plastic action partnerships at the national level, working directly with governments. We bring together the most influential and committed decision makers, experts, change makers to really work on a joint approach that's locally owned, locally driven. It puts the livelihoods and the well-being of people and communities up front. We recognize that solutions are not simple. There's no cookie cutter, there's no silver bullet, there's no one size fits all. But we really believe that if you bring the right people and the right resources to the table, these solutions can be realized. And they can put countries, regions, and cities on the fast track to radically reducing mismanaged plastic waste and transitioning sustainable circular economy for plastics. And this is why we see this valuable multi-stakeholder approach to achieving our objectives, working across a broader coalition of private sector, public sector, civil society, and international organizations like UNEP, who've been so key to so many of the items that we're building on and creating together. Next slide, please. Just so you can see here, our 3-pillar approach. Our platforms are not a trade secret. We welcome everybody into the fold. We're happy to share our approach, our learnings. the pitfalls and how we can overcome them. Again, really focusing on working together, collaborating for the greatest, most concrete and measurable progress in this fight against plastic pollution. We really believe in the national approach that then can also support at that city approach, the municipal that Laurence and his team and UNAP are doing so beautifully, building a community, creating clear analysis of the situation, and then turning commitments for the government into concrete actions. Next slide, please. So finally, I'd just say, you know, we all know, I think we're all here in agreement that plastics are undeniably essential. They're versatile, they're affordable, they're the bedrock of medical equipment, protective gear, keeping our frontline workers safe during the pandemic. But there's also this growing, worrying trend that there's an increased demand for disposable plastic products. Really appreciated what Laurence was saying through the LCA, because there is this fear of transmission in plastics and people now just really wanting single use. So how do we move beyond that, especially as we start to come out of the COVID-19 pandemic? We're going to see that the future of recycling and sustainable waste management is so critical for us and really driving the circular economy. We're going to need that government support to keep the industry moving forward in the recycling facility, but we're also going to want private sector coming to life and working with government to promote the circular economy throughout the value chain. And again, working with civil society, international organizations, together we can all support this desire to create a circular economy for plastics. We still have loads of work cut out for us. We at the Global Plastic Action Partnership, we welcome your engagement and your collaboration, whether you represent public, private sector, civil society, academia, or international organizations. We believe very strongly in the approach of public-private partnerships that are key to addressing this issue of plastic waste and pollution. So many individuals, so many organizations doing incredibly great work on their own. But if we can come together and collaborate in strategic, holistic ways, the final outcome will be much greater than the sum of our parts. So thank you for having me join you today, and I look forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Kristen. Not only was that extremely enlightening and interesting, you also perfectly stick to the time that was given to you. So that's the dream of a facilitator. Thank you very much. Maybe one follow-up question I had for you before we move on to Colston is, I'm curious about the process or mechanism you have in place to follow up on the various commitments and plans that are being adopted or put forward or developed both by private partners and others. Yeah, so I'm just curious how the forum follows up on those particular commitments.
It's an excellent question, because we as the forum we don't have a footprint in very many countries. So we're working really, really closely with other partners like UNEP, WWF, WRI in countries around the world to support these efforts. And so you've got governments who want to tackle plastic waste and pollution. They want to turn their commitments into action, but most will actually come to us and say they don't know how to do that. And I think it was Laurence, or sorry, it might have been Teresa, but somebody ahead of me was saying how policymakers need information in order to understand the roadmaps that they can or should take. And so we've created a baseline assessment model that allows governments then to understand the flows, the plastic waste flows in their countries, and then they'll actually have a much clearer understanding of the action they can take to address that waste. We're also helping them to develop action roadmaps so they know the steps that can be taken in various aspects and what that might even cost. And then we can try to pull together investments or private sector to address that. On the private sector part, they're also looking for that engagement. And there's much a domino effect. Coca-Cola maybe you have seen the day before yesterday, just started rolling out a fully recycled PET bottle. But they can only keep that commitment up if they can get the recycled PET, right? So they need the other end of the recycling value chain to be intact. So how do we bolster waste recovery, sorting, and recycling efforts throughout the world to ensure that companies like Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, etc., are able to meet their targets. So it's one of these, again, this is why we talk so strongly about the multi-stakeholder approach, because Coca-Cola can't do it on their own. The government of Indonesia can't do it on their own, but coming together, we have a much greater opportunity to turn those commitments into action.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much also for the perfect segue into the presentation from our next speaker, Colston Wesholtz. I'm sorry, Carsten, if I do not pronounce your name right. Carsten is a senior policy manager at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation that also develops some quite interesting and promising methods to work with the industry and encourage the corporate actors and other stakeholders to take on commitments to address this issue. So, Carsten, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for the kind introduction, and hello to everyone. For those who do not know us, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is a charity based in the United Kingdom, and our mission is to promote the idea of a circular economy. And to achieve this, we work with and inspire business, academia, policymakers, and institutions around the world to mobilize what we call systems solutions at scale. And since 2016 and 17, where our first reports came out on the so-called new plastics economy, the initiative has brought together key stakeholders to rethink and redesign the future of plastics, starting with packaging. Next slide, please. So based on the comprehensive modeling of the plastics economy published by the Pew and Systemic report in 2020, it is clear by now that we won't recycle or dispose our way out of the problem, nor will simply reducing our plastic usage do the trick. Instead, we need a comprehensive circular economy approach, which we describe briefly around 3 key strategies. First, we must eliminate the plastics that we do not need by scaling new delivery models without packaging or using reusable packaging, as has been mentioned by previous speakers. Secondly, we must circulate the plastics that we do need by funding, for instance, collection, sorting, and recycling, requiring investments at the magnitude of $30 billion per year globally. But even if we deploy all the solutions known today at maximum speed and scale, the result of this modeling shows that there would be still more than 150 million tons of plastic waste being incinerated, landfilled, or mismanaged every year by 2040. So we must, at the very same time, innovate at a quite unprecedented speed and scale towards new business models, product design, materials, technologies, and collection systems. Next slide, please. The good news is that there is an unprecedented level of alignment in the industry on the way forward. The new plastics economy global commitment and the Plastics Pact network already unite more than 1,000 organizations behind a common vision and clear actionable targets for circular economy for plastics. These networks have set out a clear direction of travel with all stakeholders involved working towards concrete targets for 2025, on which we then can build on further. Via the business signatories to the global commitment, we already reach out to more than 20% of the global plastic packaging market. And within the Plastics Pact network, we cover today around 20 countries who are representing 30% of GDP worldwide. Next slide, please. However, as a split of the signatories who are reporting to the new plastics economy global commitment shows, the progress is mainly driven by packaged goods companies, packaging producers, and retailers. Other parts of the plastics value chain are still underrepresented, in particular with regard to raw material producers, but also to collection, sorting, recycling companies operating in critical markets. Next slide, please. On progress towards more circularity of plastics packaging, we see increasing efforts to phase out some of the most problematic categories, such as polystyrene, PVC, and undetectable carbon black. But we also note that significant progress is being made on incorporating recycled content in some types of plastic packaging, as the example of Coca-Cola shows that Christine has just mentioned. However, from our point of view, much more needs to be done and at great speed. So for businesses, this is particularly relevant for solutions that go beyond recycling. For example, example, by setting virgin plastics reduction targets, which should be underpinned by increased action on elimination of plastics that we do not need and on scaling up of reuse business models. One key insight from our work with business partners is that rethinking the packaging alone is not enough. In fact, often you need to rethink the product and its delivery system to eliminate the need for packaging altogether. And you can find quite a few of those examples which are already in place today in our upstream innovation guide for packaging solutions. But we also need to ask fundamental questions on known recyclable formats and take bold action accordingly. For example, by embarking on a well-funded research, development, and innovation agenda focused on solutions such as new delivery models and new materials, in particular for those flexible plastics and multi-materials packaging, which are most likely to end up in the ocean. Our 2020 Global Commitment Progress Report also points out that additional efforts of policymakers are needed, to make sufficient progress. So there's first of all the need to establish mechanisms that deliver dedicated, ongoing and sufficient funding for collection, sorting and recycling, where the industry pays its fair share, for example, through extended producer responsibility schemes. And we see the need to work towards a more binding and consistent policy framework at international level, with the overarching objective, of course, to stop plastic leakage into the ocean by a certain target date, but in practice supporting a comprehensive circular economy approach where plastics never becomes waste or pollution. Next slide, please. In this context, I think it's important to recognize that the relevant policies for circular economy transition are interconnected. And that's why the Foundation has created 5 overarching universal circular economy policy goals. Goal number 1 focuses on the stimulating of the emergence of circular design for goods and services, as well as circular business models that keep inorganic and organic materials and goods in use and at the highest value possible. Goal 2 creates the systems for resource management that deliver multiple circular economy loops in such a way that the value of goods and materials are preserved. Goal 3 focuses on the broader economic, legislative, and fiscal frameworks that are just as important to make the economics of circular economy transition work. Goal 4 focuses on public but also private finance capabilities that further help to scale the circular economy through targeted investments. And Goal 5 focuses on the mechanisms that can support the mainstreaming of circular economy principles into existing and new policies. In our view, a new UN treaty to address plastic pollution could help us overcome the current patchwork of fragmented solutions and to avoid that individual policy measures will remain isolated in a wider unchanged economic system that's still based on a linear take, make, waste approach. That's why we would like governments to address circular economy for plastics through both up and downstream measures as related to goals 1 and 2, work towards goals in 3 and 4 to create the wider economic conditions and investments that are needed for scale, and all are underpinned by the so often already mentioned multi-stakeholder engagement as per Goal 5. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Colston. Again, very interesting, very informative. I have a lot of questions that I would like to follow up with, but I'm going to leave some room for others and for a larger question answer piece. But before that, I did want to follow on something where you highlighted the origin of a lot of the signatories and participants to your various initiatives, and you did highlight the smaller number of actors at each end of the supply chain, both the very upstream and the downstream waste manager. I wonder if you were thinking or if you had any thoughts you could share with us about possible strategies to increase the participation of these various actors into the scheme, as they appear to be quite critical to develop full life cycle solutions.
I mean, honestly, we work with the partners that are willing to work with us. So I think upstream, we hope that through the current group of signatories, we create enough pull for recycled materials, and also switching to non-fossil fuel based feedstocks in the value chain. While downstream, it's much more complicated because there we need to develop more tailored solutions to the geographies and to the economic conditions in the various countries. So to imply that we could find a global solution which fits into all these local contexts within one initiative is probably not going to work. That's why we have complemented the global commitment with the possibility to launch either regional or national plastic pacts, who would then work out in a multi-stakeholder approach the solutions that are required downstream.
Well, thank you very much. It does sound like a well thought out plan, and well, not only do I wish you luck, I know we're already collaborating and trying to support your objectives and trying to increase your reach and scope. So thank you very much also for laying this out. So after having heard from international organizations and partners that are working in more close and direct collaboration with the private sector, we're now going to hear a pair of speakers from governments who will talk to us about the initiatives that are being put in place in both of their country region, and also maybe tell us a little how the life cycle thinking and approach is being integrated into these kinds of strategies, national strategies and plans being developed. So we'll first start with Mr. Santika Jaya, who is a counselor for the permanent mission of Indonesia to the United Nations in Geneva. Hawidia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Right, it is my great honor to participate in this panel. I thank the Geneva Environmental Networks for organizing this important and timely discussion. Allow me to share you Indonesia's experience and perspective in dealing with plastic problems. Next slide, please. Plastic pollution has become one of the most pressing environmental issues. There is no doubt about that. However, for many developing countries, not only Indonesia, discussing plastic is often about conflicting ideas between environmental protection and economic interests. In the case of Indonesia, for example, on the one hand, I will not deny some studies suggesting that Indonesia is among the largest countries which dump plastic waste into the world's ocean. Having a large population, 270 million people living in thousands of islands, Indonesia faces enormous difficulty in effectively preventing plastic waste from entering the sea. Next slide, please. On the other hand, unfortunately, the plastic industry become increasingly important in Indonesia. There are more than 1,500 plastic production companies in Indonesia in various sizes, small, medium, large companies, which produce 4.68 million tons of plastic per year and employ more than 37,000 people. Plastic clearly harms the environment, but at the same time, for some parts of our society, plastics delivers many direct economic benefits. That situation presents a daunting challenge for policymakers when identifying policy options which could offer a win-win solution for confronting the growing threat of plastic pollution. I believe this is not only Indonesia's problem, but also a dilemma in other countries, especially in developing countries in Asia. In Indonesia, the government intended when the government intended to introduce bans on single-use plastic bags nationally in 2017, there was huge counter-reaction from industry sectors. There were resistance and even judicial review requests from plastic industries. As a result, nationwide bans on single-use plastics failed to be implemented. Up until now, there are only 2 of 34 provinces and 39 of 500 cities in Indonesia which impose bans on single-use plastics. In the same vein, a proposal by Indonesian Ministry of Finance to impose excise tax on plastic bottles last year has not been yet approved by the parliament and is intensively rejected by private sector. Next slide, please. We must realize that the narrow approach to handling plastic to date are insufficient. Plastic is not a standalone topic. It needs to be addressed comprehensively through multi-stakeholders collaboration. Imposing penalties to reduce the use of plastic is important, but at the same time, government needs to be able to provide incentive to consumers and the private sector for both reducing pollution and introducing greener products. In that context, Indonesia is pursuing a holistic policy approach to address plastic pollution. Indonesia has two main national laws which set targets to reduce marine plastic litter by 70%, reduce waste from land-based source by 30%, and increase the quantity of waste properly handled by 70% by 2025. These two national laws are implemented through 5 main activities carried out by 16 different ministries and agencies. Next slide, please. One example of policies under this holistic approach is the implementation of extended producer responsibility. Indonesia released an EPR roadmap in 2019 by giving producers an incentive to incorporate environmental considerations into the design of their products and packaging. It is also important to note that in this holistic approach, Indonesia gradually moves towards a circular economy. In that context, plastic waste is not just treated as an environmental burden resulted from linear economic activity, make, use, dispose, but plastic can be optimized in different aspects for its entire life cycle, not just in one of the stages. I will share you a couple of projects basically to try to maximize the value of plastic waste. Next slide, please. Indonesia carries out some pilot projects to turn plastic waste into electricity through gasification, a process that melts plastics at very high temperatures. The process generates a synthetic gas that could be used to produce electricity. The government of Indonesia plans to build waste-to-energy plants in 12 cities across Indonesia by 2022. In total, these plants will generate around 234 megawatts from around 16,000 tons of waste per day. 2 plants already in operation, one in city of Bekasi and the other in Surabaya. Next slide, please. Indonesian Ministry for Maritime Affairs, in cooperation with the Indonesian Plastic Recycling Association, already built some roads using recycled plastic modified asphalt mixture in 7 cities. Some studies reveal that plastic roads typically have greater wear resistance than standard asphalt concrete roads. They do not absorb water, have better flexibility, which results in less rotting and less need to repair. The government plans to expand this initiative to 16 cities across Indonesia by 2023. We also introduced refuse-derived fuel, RDF, which is fuel produced from various types of waste, including non-recyclable plastics. An RDF plant was built last year in the city of Cilacap, and the plant is able to convert 120 tons domestic waste into RDF to substitute coal in the production of cement. In coming years, more RDF plants will be developed in other locations, especially because Indonesia's state-owned companies, Cement Indonesia, has signed off-take contract to purchase RDF from waste plants across Indonesia. Of course, these projects are still small scale and at the early stage. They need more investment, financial support, technology, research, and expertise.
Okay.
Next slide. Indonesia is quite lucky as we got some support from World Economic Forum, Christine and her team, through the National Plastic Action Partnership. It is a multi-stakeholder platform for collaboration among government, industry, civil societies, and academics to work together in reducing marine plastic litter through 5 main activities. I believe that such collaboration and partnership between the government and private sector and other stakeholders are extremely fundamental to enhance our collective capacity in addressing plastic pollution. I would like to close my intervention by concluding that global shift to more sustainable growth and sustainable consumption patterns will be only successful if there is sufficient, meaningful collaboration and partnership, particularly to support developing countries in pursuing a circular economy. Thank you, David.
Very interesting presentation and very enlightening as to the various challenges and opportunities that presents to the countries, to the various countries. There's one thing that came up, and again in your presentation a number of times, which was the challenges faced by the country to find win-win solution, in particular in a globalized, very competitive economy. And one of the things that struck me as you were speaking was the value of developing global policy approaches to level the playing field that would possibly lower the level of opposition to some of the policies that are being provided. In that respect, I wanted to ask you the question, how you think a possible global approach, whether it is in the form of a treaty or other global policy, could support Indonesia in developing their own strategies and their own plans?
At least we have the Basel Convention's amendments on plastic waste. So at least we have some instruments, and Indonesia is committed to supporting the amendments. And Indonesia, since the beginning of this year, already implemented this policy in supporting the amendments. Regarding the global approach, I think it will work only if there is sufficient support for developing countries, especially to improve their capacity in managing waste. Because countries such as Indonesia, we have growing population, we have thousands of islands, and we have even in different islands, we have different capacities in different islands. So imposing a global treaty which give punishments if we do not follow the treaty will be hard for developing countries. Especially this COVID make us created some fiscal constraint for us to really focus on improving our waste management capacity. So again, basically, ideally, Indonesia will support any treaty, any international agreement which will protect environment. But at the same time, it also this treaty or whatever international agreement that will be agreed should provide sufficient support and assistance and pave the way for collaboration, not only between countries, but also with private sectors. Thank you, David.
Well, thank you very much. I think this is an extremely useful and important insight for those of us who are working on trying to develop a global approach, is the need to ensure a strong and well-functioning, not only finance mechanism to support whatever obligation would come up from the treaty, but also develop cooperation, south-to-south, north-south, public-private models for partnerships and cooperation to support the of whichever global policy piece is being put in place. So thank you very much. I sincerely hope that this is something that will be taken on and that we can all continue to work on together. Our last speaker is Hugo Shelley. He's the head of the Multilateral Environmental Cooperation Unit at DG Environment at the European Commission. And it's my great pleasure to now open the floor for you, Hugo.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back in Geneva, even only virtually. But I think it's very good that the Geneva Environmental Network actually touches on this very topical issue, which is, I think, very high on the agenda right now. And I would like to say I feel very privileged to be at the end of such a good lineup of speakers who have spoken about, Lawrence, on the very much methodological and evidence underpinning of much of the work that we've been doing on circular economy. And they have contributed a lot to the work in follow-up to the UNEA 4 resolution on circular economy, also on the one on single-use plastics. And I remember that on some of those resolutions, we actually worked very closely with Indonesia as well. And we hope to have a similar cooperation with Indonesia in view of UNEA 5 in that regard. I think the intervention by a colleague from UNCTAD very clearly shows the link between circular economy, plastics, and the consumer agenda. And I think what she highlighted, again, is very much in line with what we are trying to do. Now, both from the World Economic Forum and from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, a clear highlight on how the plurilateral stakeholder initiatives can actually add value and bring additional stakeholders to the table to create this collaborative atmosphere that has been highlighted by my colleague from Indonesia. And I think particularly also what my Indonesian colleague has just highlighted shows the dynamic policy environment that has been created in many countries on the transition to a circular economy, to sustainable consumption and production patterns, and with a specific focus on plastics in that context. So in principle, I could have stopped here because I think basically everything that can be said about the subject, all the colleagues have said, but that's not why you invited me. So I still have a couple of things to share, if I may. So if we can move to the next slide. What is happening in Europe is a follow-up to the first big wave of policy initiatives that we started following the first Circular Economy Action Plan in 2015, which now under the new Commission under President von der Leyen has been rolled over, so to speak, in the big all-encompassing initiative, which is the European Green Deal, which has survived all difficulties linked to the pandemics or to other migration crises or what have you, and remains very high on the political agenda in Europe. And it is re-emphasized once again that this is a growth and prosperity strategy for the EU in that regard. And I think that in that context, the key centerpiece that we're talking here, it is linked to the subject of today, is the Circular Economy Action Plan. And that contains sort of 35 headline actions along the entire life cycle of products. And that's very relevant for what we're discussing here with regard to plastics, which is to make sustainable products the norm in Europe. We'll roll out a sustainable products initiative and legislation later this year to empower consumers and public buyers, which is linked to what we have under the new consumer agenda in the EU. And in the implementation of the Circular Economy Action Plan, a focus on a number of key product value chains. I will come back to them in a little while. All that in view of ensuring less waste and also ensuring that the value which is built into the products remains in the economy for longer. And certainly, and that's the most important part, to make circularity work for people, regions, and cities, which means it actually should transform our economy and actually contribute to new economic and business models that actually pay very much for themselves, so that we don't have a circular economy on top of the traditional economy, but have a circular economy as the mainstream. And of course, recognizing that nothing of this we can do alone, that we actually need to partner with others in leading global efforts in regards to circular economy. And one of the specific issues, you already referred to that, David, is the issue of whether we will have a global agreement on plastics or not. Next slide, please. Now, when you look at the the product value chains, I think we actually are implementing and preparing rules, and I think the presentation of my Indonesian colleagues went exactly in the same direction, addressing design of materials and products, use, distribution, and treatment at the end of life by having mandatory essential requirements for packaging, design for reuse and recycling, labeling that facilitates correct separation of packaging waste, different rules for safe recycling into food contact materials, address the presence of microplastics in the environment, establish a policy framework on bio-based and biodegradable plastics, and of course, implement the Single-Use Plastics Directive, which actually will fully enter into force in Europe this summer. And that when you look to the left on the slide, you can see the key value chains that are relevant for plastics in the economy, which is single-use plastics, packaging, automotive, IT, food, and of course, construction and textiles and fashion. And I think all of those will be part of the streams that we're rolling out within the next 2 years. Next slide, please. Clearly, we have made a start in the Single-Use Plastics Directive, asking for minimum recycled requirement contents in certain products. And that will, in the context of the Sustainable Product Initiative, be applied to other key products such as packaging, construction materials, vehicles, IT. And the idea is that we would have 10 million tons of recycled plastics in new products by 2025 on the EU market, which would be a tripling of what currently is there. It's quite ambitious, but we still stick to that objective. Next slide, please. A specific issue that I think, again, speaks both to the design of material, to the use of products, and to the disposal of products is an issue about microplastics, which, as we all know, is divided into what we unfortunately put in there with intent, such as cosmetics, detergents, and paints, which we aim to ban in the EU through a REACH restriction dossier in 2021 to increase the sort of the cleanliness of the production chain with regard to pellets, which is the little things that are the main material for. And then, of course, the issue of the main issue of the microplastic that is created by use. And here we have tires on the one hand and textiles on the other hand. And I think, again, we will try to address that on the one hand by product regulation and product standards, but on the other hand, also with regard to seeing how can we actually address the issue of microplastics in water in the area of water treatment and water catchment in that regard. Moving on to the next of course, slide. There is a big issue about what bio-based and biodegradable plastics mean for the environment and whether they're inherently better, worse, or the same as plastics coming from original traditional life feedstock, and whether biodegradable plastics is in any way a solution for some of the environmental impacts. And I think that we're looking on the one hand to say, okay, what is the impact of a larger move to bio-based plastics on the feedstock? Is there actually enough feedstock to make the large-scale move to bio-based plastics, make that sustainable? On the other hand, the problem with the use of biodegradable plastics, as understood by some people or many consumers as a license to litter, because it actually disintegrates, so throw it away, so to avoid negative consumption patterns. And then, of course, have an economic analysis and followed by some categorization on what would be a desirable use of compostable plastics. And here I already make the difference between biodegradable and compostable in view of certain things. And I think that's ongoing and will also be rolled out in the course of this year. Moving on to the next slide. Now, I think that is only a sort of a snapshot of the policy and legislative initiatives that are happening in the EU, which I think are in parallel to a lot of similar initiatives that partner countries around the world are taking. I think inspired to a large degree by a lot of the work that has been done by international organizations, by voluntary initiatives, by stakeholder groups, and by an emerging science policy consensus that those are issues that we need to agree on. But in a way, what I think drives our assessment very much that no country is an island. I know Indonesia is composed of many islands, but it's an island that is very well connected to the rest of the world because you, like other countries, are an integral part of global value chains. And you cannot close your market to things that come in either by trade or on the oceans. So I think we're looking at what would be elements of global architecture to deal with that problem. And I think what has been on our mind for quite some time is, on the one hand, how can we promote the circular economy bilaterally, regionally, and multilaterally through development and international cooperation programs? And I think that what we will launch in 10 days' time in Nairobi at the first session of UNEA 5, the Global Alliance on Circular Economy and Resource Efficiency, where UNIDO and UNEP will partner with the EU in bringing together a number of first responders and progressive countries wanting to move ahead. And if I'm not all mistaken, I think Indonesia will be part of that. On the other hand, look to advance the analysis on what would be our safe operating space for natural resource use in view of the ensured growth and prosperity, but within, as we always say, planetary boundaries. And here again, the work that is done by UNEP after the UNEA 4 resolution on SCP is highly welcome, and I think we will use the year until next year, until the next session of UNEA 5 to fine-tune and further discuss the findings of the work that has been happening. Now, in the context of that, there are two, I'm sorry, yes, I understand. There are two reflections. One is whether there is a feasibility or desirable of an international agreement on natural resource management. That is much further down the road, alimented a lot by the work of the International Resource Panel, but then very practically, and that's already on the agenda for the next session, the second session of UNEA 5, which is the Global Agreement on Plastics, coming to the next slide. And I think that there are a couple of main principles that we need to look at. And I think that the principle is no country can do it alone. The problem is transboundary in scale and nature. Global action needs to be based on resource efficient and circular approach to plastics along its life cycle. We recognize that there are a lot of instruments that exist, be it the Basel Convention on the one hand, Regional Seas Convention on the other hand, but there are regulatory and governance gaps along the full life cycle, but are most prominent in the upstream part with regard to design of materials and products. So we need to build and take into account existing instruments and not duplicate efforts, but there needs to be embedded flexibility in the to see that national efforts, commitments can actually adjust it to the national efforts. Now, from our perspective, moving on to the next one, that is the key element that we see. And I think that I fully agree with my Indonesian colleague. This is not designed or thought as an agreement that will restrict any government. I think it's an agreement that is designed to enable and to support governments in doing what is right and what is right for them. Because a lot of the uncertainty about national response strategies comes from the absence of global standards, global agreement, and a common vision, which actually allows the government to take the necessary decisions and allows the government to take them fully knowing what products, materials that may be on their markets entail. And I think that certainly resource mobilization is a part of that one. So I think from our perspective, what we hope is, coming to the last slide, that we can build on the outcome of the ad hoc open-ended expert group that has been working now for 4 years, that we now have sufficient information to urgently go to the next step and to take a decision at UNEA 5.2 in February 22 to establish an intergovernmental negotiating committee, to actually have everybody at the table to design the architecture and the instrument that is right for everybody and is enabling and empowering partners to move forward in this direction of creating a positive global architecture that helps us beat the plastics challenge. Thank you very much, and apologies for being too long.
Well, thank you very much, Hugo. You am now faced with a challenge because, as I did for other speakers, as you were talking, I was noting down questions, but you kept on answering the questions in your next sentence or in the next slide, so I don't really have a question to follow up. But I am seeing that we are having quite a lively conversation going on in the chat, and there are a number of questions that have been put forward to the various speakers. So maybe I can put those questions to all of the speakers. And one of them that I thought was quite interesting that hasn't been addressed now is the question of to what extent or how realistic is a harmonized, legally binding EPR global a solution? How much is that a solution? So I will let the speakers decide to take the floor. If there is no volunteer, maybe we can go through the same lineup in the order of the speakers, but otherwise, if some of you feel like intervening, please feel free to do so now.
Hi, David. I'll jump in if you'd like. Again, Christian Hughes at the Global Plastic Action Partnership. From our perspective, EPR is something that's proposed quite regularly, and you saw it on a couple of slides this afternoon. It can definitely support the system so long as it's actually being utilized properly to address plastic pollution and is not seen as just another tax. I think you'll see that a lot of the brands feel that they're coming together around EPR and they're supporting it because they've seen the benefits that happen in the e-waste space, and now we're seeing it again in the plastics. But again, making sure that as the EPR is designed and delivered, it's not just taxing and then those funds go to something else, but that actually we have a design in place that the EPR then also comes back to support the circular economy through investments in recycling, sorting, collecting, etc.
Go ahead, please.
I didn't see, so thank you. I don't see a possibility to raise hands, so I raised my real hand. So I hope that works. I would just add to that for me, the value of a global architecture would be in establishing common principles and in facilitating the exchange and the transmission of information about product and material and chemical characteristics of products along the value chain, which actually allows a very economical setup of national systems to deal with that. So that would be a benefit in itself. I don't think that it is realistic to talk about, if that's ever meant, a global EPR system. I think it's so that the value chain is well integrated into a common understanding and a common system of extended producer responsibility. So that to facilitate the appropriate action at national and, as the case may be, regional level. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may come in as well, I mean, we have also identified EPR as a key part of the solution, which needs to be integrated with other policy measures upstream, obviously. But in general, I think it's important to note that it doesn't make sense to limit EPR only for plastics. You would have to set up a broader system covering different materials which are relevant for your waste management system. And when it comes to a global agreement, I agree with Hugo saying probably alone a definition and classification system of the different materials which could be captured through an EPR system would already help then national governments to set up an appropriate system. And again, we are very much convinced that to develop a system that works in practice, you need to set up a multi-stakeholder approach to tailor the general idea of the general principles how EPR functions, to match it with the geographic starting points in the respective countries. But we are pretty sure that by aligning and making data and definitions available at global level, that this would facilitate the work on EPR systems in different areas of the world.
Maybe just to add briefly, if I can, I mean, I agree with what has been said, and I think, I mean, just the key thing is really that maybe these common principles should be shared, as Hugo was saying, and there are many elements that we see EPRs can work very well, but they need to be designed well and they have to be implemented well. And, you know, particularly bringing in elements of the eco-modulation, for instance, on the fees. So you really send a very clear signal to the designers of the products that are entering the market. So those products that are easier and cheaper to move around, then they can contribute less, whereas those that really require much more infrastructure to actually not become problematic, then they need to contribute more. So that's one part of the principle. It is difficult to make it kind of common for absolutely every country, but I think we all agree that this certainly can be a good part of the solution when designed adequately. And I think maybe also it's useful to highlight that at the global level, as Hugo was saying, the sharing of information is very useful, and that could be part of this kind of maybe a globalized framework for EPR schemes.
Thank you very much. Teresa, Awidia, would you like to add something on this particular question?
Thank you. No, frankly, not really. I can support what the previous speaker said, that are much more knowledgeable in this specific area. I do think it is, from even a theoretical point of view, a very ambitious and appropriate manner to deal with a global issue. I do see, as Hugo mentioned first, I think that this is a little bit unrealistic, probably. Of course, the sharing of information is essential. I do see benefits in trying to gather this or improve and increase information sharing and experiences and knowledge at regional level, especially considering, of course, the universe of the developing countries, which are, of course, extremely diverse, that UNCTAD mainly assists. So this will be just a couple of ideas. Thank you.
Well, if I might add, Indonesia just implemented EPR roadmap last year. So I think as too far to have global harmonized legally binding EPR scheme. So I think I agree with other speakers that at this stage we start with sharing information and sharing experience from different countries, how they enforce EPR policy, how institutional capacity that they have to implement the policy. So basically, this is a good idea to harmonize the EPR, the legally binding IPR, but for Indonesia, still too early. And I believe many countries also face the same problems. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all six of you. We are getting to the very end of the time we had allocated together. I feel like we could have been speaking together. I could have been speaking with you for another hour or two. I surely have questions and a lot of more things to learn and comment on. But this is the value of this particular series. We will come back to a number of those issues. We can also look forward to a number of spaces where this discussion continues, whether it's UNIA, whether it's regional forums, whether it is the World Economic Forums or other spaces. And so really, I wanted to thank you very much again. I wanted to thank the Geneva Environment Network for their support in organizing this event. And to close, I would like to give the floor for a final conclusions to Diana as the organizer of this series. Thank you very much again to all participants and speakers. And Diana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. Indeed, thank you to all the speakers, but also thank you to you, David, for having moderated this session, and thank you also to who is working behind the scenes. And also thank you to the attendees to this session and to who will be watching the session later on, as it's going to be available on the webpage of the event.